Catherine Jelinek. I'm here today with Bobi Siembieda, EOS implementer, here to share about her nugget on the best hires are made when there's a process in place. Hi, Bobi. Tell us more about
Hi,
this.
hi, Catherine. I have a number of clients that are doing their very best to fill some tough positions. And unfortunately, there have been a number of fits and starts. They hire someone they think is the right candidate for any number of reasons, and then they find out that person's not the right candidate. And oftentimes there is a recruiter involved, and a recruiter fee's been paid, and they're scratching their heads as to why the recruiter is not supplying them with better candidates or why this candidate didn't work. And honestly, just as I advise my clients that solutions start at the leadership team table, this is no different. They have to have a process in place that not only are they hiring for a functional role in the organization, but they have to define what that role really is. And it's really not just a job description. It's to define it fully by, when we talk about the three parts of the mind, I am a Kolbe certified consultant, so I'm very much into the three parts of the mind: the affective, the cognitive, that's the Kolbe piece, and the cognitive, right? So, you know, even communication doesn't start in this world without the affective, right? The a feeling, something to communicate about, right? Even the most introverted people can speak clearly about subjects because it's purposeful, right? And it comes from the affective. They feel purpose behind it. So I would want them to define, not only do they have their values in the world of EOS, to look at and say, does this person truly embody our values? But they have to do it not by feel, they have to do it by asking some very situational and behavioral questions. And so, yes, they have to do the work to put those questions together and then decide who in the process is going to be asking what questions, right? They have to understand, what other motivational things or behaviors they want to see from an affective standpoint. There are assessments out there like DISC and predictive index and strength finders and geniuses that can help them with those pieces. The cognitive side is solely Colby. I've not met a tool other than Colby that can really get to what will they do when they're striving. And it is amazing how accurate it is. I've proved it to myself over and over and over again how when we've taken the time to do a Colby C to get a baseline on a position and we hire against that Colby C, it's an epic fail. Eventually, at that 90-day mark, even a 6-month mark, we're going to see cognitive stress, and that person implodes, and they don't work out, and they end up leaving, right? And then you've got to go through that whole process of training all. And then another piece that people don't do a lot of really good interviewing around is that cognitive side. They look at their resume and they ask some nice, easy questions, or talk about, describe to me, about this process, and they just don't go far enough to understand the true cognitive abilities of this individual and perhaps even check their references enough to find out what they've done, right? And oftentimes they have a team of people doing interviewing. And because they haven't taken the time to get unified and wrapped around one definition of that role, everyone's looking at it differently. They're weighing in separately, and they don't really come back together against a rubric to say which of these things are the most important things in this particular role, right? And when I've had people that have done that, they have absolutely hired successfully and for the long term. So it's a fervent plea of mine for people to do the work, do the work to get those good hires and blame no one. Just, I mean, we all know hiring is an art, but it's much more, it comes out much more successfully when you do all the upfront work that's necessary. And once you've done that work for a role, you can edit it and change it based on your success in that. But at least you've got that foundational piece so that from that point on, you can make the adjustments that are necessary. But from that point on, you can utilize that information moving forward and save yourself a lot of that time, basically. Because people will move on, whether they work out or not, people will move on to take a different opportunity. We're going to be hiring for the same position at some point in time in the future. Might as well catalog that and have that part of our core processes and our people process, right? And that's, to me, that is one of a very, very important people process to nail down, because too many people are just still shooting from the hip when they're doing their hiring and getting it wrong and then being very upset and frustrated when it doesn't work out because they now have the need to go back through it all over again and experience the time and effort, the cost, and they're not necessarily any clearer the next time around. I've seen it happen many, many, many times. So that's my fervent plea is, the best hires are made when you take a look at those candidates and we talk about hiring slow, firing fast in the process. We have to do the job, cross the T's, dot the I's to get the right candidates. And a recruiting firm can only bring you choices of candidates based on your best definition of the role. They can bring the candidates to bear, but we have to remember they aren't hiring them, we are. So we have to bless the candidate. We have to say, yeah, I don't even see a yellow flag here. I'm ready to go. This candidate's the right flag, the right candidate. If there's any flag at all, no, no, we don't hire to satisfy a rock or for anyone. We hired to hire the right candidate, and we just keep going until we find that right candidate.
To codify this, because it can feel like such a, yeah, there's nothing there in so many cases. It's, yes, like you said, shooting from the hip, and it's the most important thing, the people we have in our organizations. Can you, just for the sake of clarity, go over the definitions of those three separate parts of the brain? Yes, that you're confirming and hiring and checking against: the affective, the cognitive, and I'm sorry, the third I'm
Cognitive.
forgetting.
So the
Cognitive.
affective is the motivation, right? The creative process starts with that. That's all of your personality. That's why something like DISC, it's all your personality. Your personality changes and evolves over time, right? It develops as you develop as a human being. So that's the affective, and it's basically the motivation, your desire, and so forth, right? The cognitive, obviously, is all your skills and experience that you bring to bear, your education, right? And there are so many things that need to be checked in that, essentially, to ensure that the right skills are there, the right things are in not only just a resume, but that they can talk about them and they've really done them. If they're that important, and you can certainly prioritize what skills or what education or what experience is more important than something else in a particular role, and what's a plus and what's not, right? And then from the standpoint of cognitive, that is what you will do. You're instinctual. You're born with your cognitive instincts. It is your cognitive instincts, what you will do when you're striving. And it's, it's the Colby basically. And Colby has a way, it's called the Colby C and the Colby A. Every individual has the Colby A, their own personal strengths. And then the Colby C is when we know what the role is, and we've taken the time to have the person who either does the role the best, or usually the superior that is hiring for it, define what a person who's going to sit in that role thinks, acts, and behaves like, basically. So we give them a Colby C, which is a different assessment. They answer it from that perspective, and then we get a baseline for that seat. And then all the candidates we get, when we get their Colby A's, we can run them through what's called a right fit analysis and determine how, a range of success for that candidate from a cognitive standpoint. It's how they will behave. So let's say, and a cognitive thing is, you have a person who needs to pick up the phone and make cold calls. If they have a Colby that is completely doesn't include the behaviors to do that, that phone's going to feel like it weighs 1,000 pounds to them, and they might be able to do it for a while because cognitively they're going to push their way through it, but it's going to be very stressful for them to do it long term. And we call that cognitive stress, and eventually that person will crash and burn, right? So it's a very important one not to skip, because you can get a person in, think they're going great guns for 90 days or so, and then over time their performance will start to degrade because they can't keep it up. They're depleting the amount of energy they have, mental energy they have, just to do the task that they're trying to do.
That
Does that
is
help?
really insightful, because it's very hard to indicate that without doing something like Kobe.
Yep. It's kind of like that secret sauce, right? And it is amazing, and it works. I've proved it to myself over and over again. Whenever I've said, maybe you can get away with this, it's close enough. Uh, it just, no, it definitely is. If the person's not wired to do it, over time, their performance will degrade. They will be in a bad situation, and so will you. There's
Okay,
no
I'm going to
question.
ask just a few more detailed
Mhm.
follow-up questions. And if it's too minutia, just let me know. But it sounds like you're sharing definitely do the Kobe, potentially do something like the disc for the affective. And then in terms of the cognitive, that sounds like where I'm hearing the traditional interview process can come into play, and doing things like checking references. Just guide me to how a team can functionally embed the process for each of those three parts.
Well, they have to do the work to define for the affective piece. They've got to do the work to have the behavioral questions that would get to whether or not a person is a right fit from a values standpoint, their core values, right? And also things like strength finders and geniuses, even predictive index, DISC, all of those are different assessments that give you a different look at the candidates, basically a different view of them from an effective standpoint. And actually, I could argue that geniuses might even be more along the experience and cognitive than it is affective, but I can't say that with direct. I'm not certified in it, so I can't say that. But at any rate, I think that those others give you a really good view of a candidate. And I like multiples because you can start to see in some of the affectives, people can answer from the perspective of what they think you want to hear. And unlike Colby, it won't get a mismatch on something because you're not going against your grain and answering in consistent ways. So it doesn't throw up an undistinguished result, essentially. So you've still got to look at that and say, well, why does this conflict with this? And that allows you the intuition to say, I got to ask more questions about X because I'm seeing something that doesn't compute, right? It's always interesting to me. So I also see, I've done interviewing of candidates and I'm not certified in predictive index or any of the others. I'm only certified in Colby. But I know what Colby tells me and I know I can rely on it. And that's what they're going to act like, period, because they've got a clean result. I can see that if something says something about someone not being a fact finder, for example, or they don't do details well or something like that in some other assessment, I can come back to that, especially if Colby's telling me they are a fact finder, they are a detail oriented person. I can say, so how, I can ask questions about that. So it's not even just, having canned questions. It's being able to look at the assessments, take time to review them, and come up with additional questions based on that. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm just trying to get into how teams can really tackle each of those three areas in their
Got it.
process. And it sounds like that for the affective and the cognitive, it's really important to have
The
that,
assessment.
yeah, the Colbys and the discs or different assessments to take care of some of that, and then to confirm other things in the interview. And
I
then for
agree.
the cognitive, is that really dependent on the interview and doing things like checking references
I think it's
and
dependent on the
open-ended?
role. So, for example, I hired college students, for trainee positions for programming years ago in my previous life, and they all knew how to code, right? But I would put them through a standard logic test and be able to see how well they could follow logic and follow it through and think on it and so forth. And it also helped me understand, do they read well? Do they have a command of the language because they're taking a test, right? We were a services environment, so they had to have a command of the language and be able to explain things and so forth. So it allowed me to see those things because I had a test, a skills test that they could take. It was a logic test, basically, that they could take. And I happened to know through a lot of experience that my candidates who scored at a certain level were the better candidates than others, that I would have to invest more time in certain candidates if I hired them, if all other things were equal, and I hired somebody that had a lesser score. They passed, but it was a lesser score. I knew I'd have to put more time and effort into them to get them to where I needed them to be. So
I
there
like
are
that.
tons of skills tests out there too that depending on the role, you can and other assessments to assess cognitive abilities, the command of language, the command of math skills, whatever is necessary in a particular role.
To kind of try on the role and the certain aspects that are most important to that specific role and ensure that
Yes.
they're able to do it regardless of how much experience they've had.
Yes.
Hmm. That's really important. Wonderful. Well, this is a powerful nugget and something that I think you've taken to a very detailed degree. I mean, there's one thing to like set a process around interviewing and hiring, but another to really think about the different parts of the brain and addressing each of them in the appropriate way.
Yeah, it gets to that core of, who is the best candidate, right? And then the other process wraps around that as far as if we're going to have three people interview this person, what's our process look like for that, right? So is there a rubric that everybody's scoring on how they felt at a certain point? Have we, in the crudest form, a spreadsheet rubric of, give us your score on a scale of 1 to 5. How well did this person do on these different things? So we have something to compare. Because if you're interviewing 5, 6, 7, 8 people, you're not going to remember it. You're not going to remember every candidate individually. So if you take the time after each interview and score them and the rubric and then come together and talk about it, you'll be able to remember each candidate better and come to an agreement on who's the better candidate. And of course, the hiring manager is the person who gets to make that decision, but at least they're informed with everything everybody's got, right? From that point of view, and they can consider all of that, or pull that person back in again, or one or two people back in again, and do a secondary or a third or a fourth interview, depending on what's necessary. But making sure you're crossing those T's and dotting those I's and doing that work will ensure better success. Otherwise, you're going to spin through a lot of people.
I think that to just underscore that point as a final tidbit here is if you're going to go through the effort of creating so much process, you have to have aligned documentation with the entire team involved and really stick to it, or else you're going to be losing the precious information you're taking so much time to gather.
Yes. And the biggest issue is a lot of the teams we work with aren't of the size that they have a true HR department. So unfortunately, it goes undone, and then they suffer the consequences of that. So someone needs to take the horn and get that done, whether it's our integrator or the finance manager, or somebody has to be appointed the owner of that to get that done.
Thank you. That is a fantastic final point to just ensure that this is done the right way, is to have someone really owning
Mm-hmm.
hiring and the process around hiring. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this, Bobi. It was very clearly laid out, and I think it takes a lens that I haven't heard, and I've been in this entrepreneurial world for my career, and so really thinking about the different parts of the brain and then matching the process to considering each of those. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, take care, Bobi. This episode of the Podcast of Nuggets is presented by The Skinny Platform and is released in support of Freedom Reads, a national nonprofit opening handcrafted, curated 500-book libraries in prison cell blocks across America. Freedom Libraries are more than just books. They are lifelines. They bring connection, hope, and dignity to prisons. Learn more at freedomreads.org. Freedom begins with a book.